Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Guy Standing.
Thank you. Good evening. With these lights, I can't see you, but I hope that this will be enough to keep some of you still awake. You've been listening to a lot of interesting speeches. And there's nobody more boring than an economist who's just written a book about a subject that he feels strongly about, except someone who's written 2 books on the subject which he feels strongly about, and then he's really boring. So I hope you can stay long enough to listen. I'd like to begin by quoting a statement made by Theresa May to the Bank of England last November. And she said, "A free market economy operating under the right rules and regulations is the greatest agent of collective human progress ever created, and is unquestionably the best and indeed the only sustainable means of increasing the living standards of everyone in society." That means the government believes in free markets, they've been building free markets, and it produces the best results. I think it's difficult to make a definitive judgment on the last point, because the second point is a lie. In fact, I'm going to argue that in fact we have the most unfree market system ever created. To go back a little bit, this is a moment when we're in the middle of a global transformation. Those of you who are familiar with Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation will recognize what's taking place. And the disembedded phase of this global transformation began, roughly speaking, in about 1980, when a bunch of renegade economists who'd formed the Mont Pelerin Society after the Second World War suddenly became the flavor of the moment, and no less than 8 of the 36 original members of the Mont Pelerin Society went on to receive Nobel Memorial Prizes in economics. We think of them as neoliberals these days, but that's a pejorative term that's come into popular parlance, often by non-economists. But I think you can see the main tenets of their approach. They believed in financial market liberalization, the commodification of everything that can be commodified, and privatization, and very critical to what's been happening ever since, the systematic dismantling of all institutions of social solidarity, because they stand against the market. They prevent the market from clearing, as the terminology went. And essentially you can see that the Mont Pelerin group put property rights above market forces. They actually were not against monopoly because they presumed that competition would whittle away monopolies and therefore they didn't have to worry about it. They also promoted, and governments all over the world eagerly accepted, a strategy of flexible labor markets. What that meant in reality was dismantling the social income that had been built up in the post-war era, where more and more of income were being paid in non-wage benefits, state benefits, community benefits that were beyond the wages. Now, what's happened since they came into dominance in the 1980s with Reagan and with Thatcher and around the world with structural adjustment policies, the sort of bankers took over that we've just been listening to. Essentially, my thesis in the first of the books, which is called The Corruption of Capitalism, is that the income distribution system of the 20th century has broken down. And it's broken down irretrievably. We didn't really need Thomas Piketty to show that all over the world, a rising proportion of national income in country after country going to capital has corresponded, obviously, with a declining share going to labor. That's been taken place as much in China as in the United States and in Britain and in every OECD country. Two other critical points. This has corresponded, this period, with a technological revolution. Whatever number you wish to call it, I don't mind. I have had plenty of showers since then. I've just come from speaking in Davos. Davos, they decide it's fourth in technological revolution, fourth industrial revolution. I probably think it's the 24th, but never mind. The technological revolution has made it much easier for corporations and capital to relocate production and employment and made it much more dominant in bargaining with those who are supplying labor. And you have to, as economists, appreciate that in this period, since 1980 to now, the world's labor supply has effectively quadrupled. An extra 2 billion people have become part of a globalizing labor market. And all of those people have been coming from emerging market economies where wages and living standards were 1/50th of what a typical British or American worker would have regarded as the norm in the 1980s and 1990s. So there's been huge downward pressure on wages in OECD countries, and we've had 30 years of stagnant real wages. It's a pretty daunting, stylized fact. At the same time, we've had a reversal of what Keynes had predicted in 1936. He said there would be the euthanasia of the rentier during the remaining years of the 20th century. As capital became more abundant, the ability of rent-seeking would decline. In actual fact, when you tease the statistics on income and wealth distribution, what has been happening is a rising share of capital has been going in forms of rent, and a rising share of the diminishing share going to labor has been going in rental forms to the upper income groups in the labor force. And in that process, and this is what I've been writing about, we've had a new global class structure taking place. I plead on all of you as the future generation of economists not to dismiss class. Class matters. And don't let your teachers, your lecturers, and your professors pretend otherwise. The global class structure has a plutocracy at the top, an elite just below them, all earning billions and multi-millions. Below them, a salariat with long-term employment security, nice occupational pensions, paid this, paid that, paid bonuses, paid the rest of it. These three groups are earning more and more of their income from forms of rent, returns to property, financial property, physical property, and most of all, intellectual property. Below them, the old working class, the proletariat, has been disappearing around the world. And the welfare states and the trade unions and the labor laws of the 20th century were geared to that group. But they are diminishing in strength and numbers. And below that, it's the precariat. I wrote a book in 2011, which has been translated into 20 languages, where I said that the precariat is the new dangerous class. The precariat can be defined in terms of people being habituated to accept a life of unstable labor. Without an occupational narrative or trajectory to their lives, they have to do a lot of work that doesn't get recorded in unusably bad labor statistics, but they have to do it. It consists of millions of people who are increasingly having to rely solely on money wages. They don't get access to non-wage benefits, they don't get access to rights-based state benefits, And the wages that they have had to receive have been declining in real terms, becoming more volatile and uncertain. And above all, people in the precariat know this around the world, they have been losing the rights of citizenship, social rights, cultural rights, economic rights, political rights. And it's a dangerous class because part of it is atavistic. They're the ones backing the neo-fascist populists. Part of it are what I call nostalgics, the migrants, the minorities, who don't see in the political spectrum anything to represent them, so they stay out of it. And part of it are the progressives, the young who've been going to university and they were promised a future. But they come out of university and they have debts, and millions of them are finding they have no future. This group is the growing group, and why I am ultimately optimistic. Because they won't vote for neo-fascist populists. They are realizing they must reinvent a politics of paradise, a progressive politics. And as their numbers grow, and the Occupy movement and the various new political movements gradually taking shape, they will define the new progressive politics of the 21st century. Now, I want to go back from that after saying that I have the dubious pleasure of being able to boast that on page 1 of that book on the precariat, I predicted that unless people came to understand what the precariat was all about and address their insecurities, we would very soon see a political monster. Page 1. You will not be surprised that since November 2016, an incredible number of people have written to me saying, your political monster has arrived. It will get worse, I fear. And I think we have to go back to what has been happening to this global market system. Because the first lie is that we have a free market economy. And here I think one has to realize what the financiers, we've just listened to one, but there are lots and lots of others, carefully constructed in the 1980s, 1990s. It's a structure, a global architecture, which preserves property rights and intensifies property rights and is ultimately responsible for the structural inequalities we're facing today. And the key event is not the Bretton Woods institutions, but a little organization that was down a road in Geneva, where I was working at that time in the United Nations. And we laughed at that institution because it sounded like a detergent company. It sort of suggested that if we went there, we could make our shirts whiter than white. And we laughed. If you go to Geneva today, it's the biggest bureaucracy with a fantastic conference center strutting out into the sky. It's called WIPO. It sounds like a detergent, right? WIPO. It means the World Intellectual Property Organization. And in 1995, led by the US and by Goldman Sachs and various other financial institutions reporting to central bankers, they passed TRIPS. Now, TRIPS means the trade-related aspects of intellectual property. As a result of TRIPS, we had a globalization of intellectual property rights. If I give you just a few statistics to get a capture of a feeling of what's been happening. In 1995, fewer than 1 million patents were filed with WIPO. Last year was the first year, 2016, the report's just come out, 2016 was the first year when more than 3 million patents were filed with WIPO. I remind you what they are. A patent, if you file it and it's accepted, gives you a monopoly income for 20 years. Nobody else can compete. Nobody else can produce because you got the patent. In pharmaceuticals, it's 40 years. Today, there are more than 12 million patents in force around the world, and it's been globalized. So you've got a string of monopolistic practices. So the mega corporations and the plutocratic corporations buy up and they hoover patents. So they have thousands of patents, which gives them guaranteed billions of dollars of profits. If this is a free market, I'm a duck. And I don't quack very well. So this is the first thing, and then you add to it that they allow publicly funded research to lead to corporations having patents. So we, as taxpayers, are paying to undercut the risk of doing the research, so they can't say it is a return to taking risks. It's us who are often taking the risks. That is a part of it. Many patents are taken out not to facilitate production, but to stop anybody producing it because they don't want a near substitute for what they're producing to be produced. In addition, it vastly strengthened copyright. Under copyright, which has multiplied many, many times since 1995, it guarantees the owner of a copyright a monopoly income for the whole of their life, plus 70 years. In some cases, if it's to do with corporate work, it's 95 years. Again, if this is a free market, I'm a duck. It's not. The same with industrial designs, which have been multiplying, and trademarks. There are now more than 7 million trademarks as of 2016, all giving monopolistic flows of money. This system has been strengthened by more than 3,200, and I document them in the book, 3,200 trade and investment agreements. If you look at the investment agreements, it's mainly about protecting property rights. And at the top of the cake, as it were, is the ISDS. I love acronyms in this business. Economists have to be expert at acronyms. The ISDS is the investor-state dispute settlement. And a corporation can sue any government if it introduces any policy which affects their future profits. Think about it, if we were able to do that as individuals. You know, any government policy change that affected my future income, I could go and sue them for reparations. Corporations can do that today. And what makes it slightly more interesting is there are 3 judges in every case. The corporation gets to appoint the first judge, a government gets the second judge, and the corporation must agree on the third judge. If I'm not mistaken, this sounds like a fixed system, especially as if nobody can agree on that third judge, it's appointed by the president of the World Bank. Okay? And the president of the World Bank must always be an American citizen. So you will be enormously surprised that the American government, as defendant, has never lost a case before the ISDS. I don't know how that happens, but that's the case. But what's been happening, and I'm not going to go into it in detail, but I want to throw it out there for potential research as you go through your various levels of degree. China has emerged as the biggest rentier economy in the world. Last year, for example, China accounted for 98% of the increase in patents. And in recent years has been filing more patents than the United States, Japan, South Korea, and the whole of European Union combined. And you can interpret the Trump type of protectionism and the lashing out as a state of decline in manipulating the institutions of rentier capitalism. Now, a second lie is that international property rights encourages and rewards risk-taking and facilitates growth. Not only is research and development largely publicly funded, so that's one bit of the lie, there is no statistical evidence that intellectual property rights promotes innovation or is associated with increases in economic growth. What it is clearly associated with is the development of superstar corporations that are the Hoovers of the Hoovers. So the 5 biggest platform corporations in the United States have systematically bought up any potential rival. They bought 519 corporations in the last 10 years. And in the process, of course, they are monopolistic, and a corporate culture of interlinkages has been built up. The next lie in this claim that there's a free market system is that governments, particularly Britain, but also many, many others, have been churning out vast amounts of subsidies. In the course of writing the book on the corruption of capitalism, I obtained from the Treasury the number of selective tax reliefs in this country. This government has built them up so that there are now 1,156 forms of tax relief. Quite a large number. Systematically, I've got the data here with the figures over the last 6 years of the actual amount. These are regressive. And basic economics, subsidies increases distortions in markets, inefficiencies, and it is regressive. The Treasury cannot give full numbers on the amount of income foregone by the exchequer. But they have given figures on the top 209 of these tax reliefs. If I tell you that they came to a total value of £403 billion per year, you might get an idea of the scale of subsidies. Because they're only the tip of the iceberg, these type of subsidies. There are others as well. I won't go into that because I want to get to my final part of the narrative. But £403 billion given out to selective interests means that it's much more than the total amount of spending on the National Health Service and our public education. It gives you an idea of the scale. And the subsidies include a whole lot of other selective measures, so that capital today is taxed at a much lower rate than labor, and wealth is hardly taxed at all. Inheritance tax is disappearing, and that's a key aspect of my long-term debate. Both in the United States, in Britain, and many other countries, they moved to tax credits. It's extraordinary that every year Britain spends more than £30 billion on tax credits. The United States spends about $100 billion on its earned income tax credit. Extraordinarily, or it should strike us as extraordinarily, since they started in the 1990s until today, there has been no official evaluation of the effects of tax credits. I've been given just 5 minutes. Sorry about that. But tax credits are a form of Spinelman system, keeping wages low. Much of the tax credit goes to capital. The next aspect of this free market economy is that debt has become a systematic mechanism. of extracting from the precariat and others. I give many quotes from financiers, leading financiers. They want all of us to be in debt. That's how they make their money. It's not a genius if you can work that out. The sixth, an important thing, which I'm not going to talk about, I'll just flash it by you because it's another area that desperately needs good research, is that there's been a plunder of the commons. The neoliberal orthodoxy is because the commons has no price, it has no value, and therefore you can give it away to property interests. We've been losing our commons, and we're seeing a plunder of it. And the seventh and key point is a claim that many mainstream economists have made, to their shame, I think, which is that work is the best route out of poverty. You may have heard that. The reality is that 60% of the poor in this country are in jobs. The reality is that wages have been declining, and it's harder and harder for people in the precariat to attain or maintain a reasonable standard of living. Basic laws of economics, when I was a student, have broken down. It used to be the case that when productivity went up, wages went up. Not anymore. The jaws of the snake have been opening. A lot of figures that have been showing that. The second thing, it used to be that when employment went up, wages went up. Not anymore, because the new jobs are coming up tending to pay much lower wages. The Phillips curve has broken down completely. And it will continue to break down with the development of platform capitalism and so on. It used to be the case that when employment went up, tax revenue from employment went up. Poor old George Osborne found that that didn't work in 2014. Tax revenue was going down because more and more people were in the sort of jobs that weren't paying any tax. Now here we are in a situation where the income distribution system is not going to come back. As you go through to your PhDs and beyond, I predict that real wages in OECD countries will not be rising. They won't rise. And therefore, we have to look to build a new income distribution system. And why I support a basic income as an economist is that I think a basic income has to be a base, an anchor in that new system. By itself, it's not a panacea. Whether it's the robots coming and that are going to displace millions, or, as I believe, increase the inequalities and the disruptiveness of the labor market, it's not going to overcome this growing crisis of structural inequality. A basic income, first of all, is affordable. Think about it. I've got a whole chapter in the other book on various ways you could pay for it. We've just done pilots in India, where we provided thousands of people with a basic income, modest. It resulted in improvements in nutrition, in health, in schooling, in economic activity, in women's status. It was a transformative policy in rural areas because it led to networking and multiplier effects that we as economists can understand. But what touched me most was after we completed and we wrote the book and the results had been presented, and Sonia Gandhi expressed astonishment and said to us, well, she wished she'd known. Last year, the Minister of Finance of the Indian government tabled in Parliament the same day as his budget statement, saying a basic income is affordable in India. Can you imagine how I felt that day? But we can have it in any country in the world. We can have it because it will stimulate work that is not labor. It will lead to us using more of our time in caring for others, for working in the community, in ecological work. These are valuable forms of work that our conventional economics treats as non-work. You can't get more sexist than ridiculous than that. Many of the most valuable forms of activity that all of us would love to do are treated as non-work by mainstream economics. Think about what the implication is that you are not measuring or capturing what millions of people are actually doing or wanting to do. The beautiful thing is that a basic income is not a panacea. It's part of a package that needs to be developed. Encourages ecologically sustainable activities rather than resource-depleting jobs. That's powerful, I think. I've dealt with the standard objections. I'll end with just one. Some critics, usually very self-respecting critics, say, oh, damn it, we don't want to give something for nothing. We don't want to give these people something for nothing. At the same time, they've just inherited £1 million or dollars from their dying relatives. I don't notice them leaping to the barricades saying we must abolish private inheritance, which, if I'm not mistaken, is something for nothing in spades. I believe that a basic income will be emancipatory. It will give people a sense of security. And that's the greatest form of inequality we have today. Millions of people are facing a life of chronic insecurity. Maybe some in the room have that feeling or know people with that feeling. And unless we have a strategy for overcoming that economic insecurity, we're not going to have a healthy politics, we're not going to have a healthy society, and we're not going to be personally healthy. We can do better than that. Thank you very much.
Insightful and challenging address, and I think it's put into perspective a lot of different things for us, so thank you very much for that. We are nearing the end of the evening, but we've got time for a few questions, probably about two. We'll start with the most popular one, and that's from WVPU delegate, whoever you are. What do you think are the most important assets for countries fighting income distribution inequalities? The questions are down there as well.
Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
I think I'm going to answer it in one way, and I can see another way of answering it as well, so I hope I get the gist of it. I think we've got to realize that this system of rentier capitalism is giving these plutocrats and the elites and the other upper income groups fantastic rental income. And I believe that we must build sovereign wealth funds, capital funds, call it what you like, based on a levy on all forms of rent. You can't justify rent from an economic perspective or from a moral perspective. If we build a sovereign wealth fund like the Norwegians have done, they used North Sea oil, whereas Britain stupidly privatized it, so that today Norwegians are actually all millionaires. So if you're looking for a husband or a wife, focus on a Norwegian. They have developed a fantastic scheme, a system, and I describe it in the book, where they apply the Hartwick rule, an economic rule which says that any resource should only be used and for the benefit of today's generation, as long as it also benefits future generations. A complex formula for doing that, but the Norwegians apply it. I think we should now build our fund in this country from collecting the rents. I think you could do that by rolling back subsidies and various other ways, which I've described in the book. A sovereign wealth fund, like, say, that they've used in Alaska, with the Alaska Permanent Fund, can be used to pay out the basic income. It's the best way of affording it. And I think the asset of property is where we have to focus on raising more income. Land value tax, a carbon tax, that sort of thing, focusing on those things which are not income. What's the other one?
Unfortunately, I think we run out of time for questions.
One more, yeah.
Let's do one more.
Okay.
The one that's most upvoted is that if patents are not an option, which is a good incentive for innovation?
I think Thomas Jefferson said in 1813, he said, ideas in nature should not be the subject of property. So in principle, I'm against patents, copyright, and so on. The argument that they give incentives can be met with other forms of rewards for inventions, proper inventions, prizes, government, action. You don't need heavy-duty patents that are just blanket. If you have copyright, under Queen Anne, which was rather a long time ago, they were first introduced when they would only give a guarantee to the owner of a copyright for 14 years. I would say that's probably a good maximum for an artist or a poet or a writer. That means they will have their income from their creations. But to make it for the whole of your life plus 70 years is just crazy.
Too long.
Too long, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well that brings us to the